Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Industrial Revolution. We're going to take up today's class from where we left off in the last class, and that is by taking a look at our learning outcomes. So, in the last class, we started to know four major facts about the areas of the transport revolution. Now, we only got through the first point, so I'm going to follow up on that today and start with that and continue the other 3 points. We're by the end of this presentation, you should also know about the living conditions in the slums and some of the diseases associated with the Industrial Revolution. And also, thirdly, we should know some reforms that were brought in to improve the living conditions and some of the key reforms during the Industrial Revolution. Now, as I said in the end of the last class, we took a look at roads and we looked at how roads were improved from just dirt tracks to roads with tolls and how they developed and had massive changes, such as irrigation systems on either side of the roads and trenches so that water would drain from them and they could drive in both rainy conditions and dry conditions. The second point we're going to look at is canals. Now, in 1798, James Brindley built the Worcester to Manchester Canal for Duke Bridgewater, and this is why it was called the Bridgewater Canal, as we can see here. Now, the Bridgewater Canal was created to transport coal from the mines to the locations such as factories. Now, this greatly reduced the cost of coal and it also increased the speed in which coal could be transported. In 1790, canal building increased massively. Up to 6,500 kilometers of canals were built by the year 1840. Now, this canal mania didn't just extend to England, it also carried through to Ireland, where we see the Grand Canal in Dublin being built. Now, at the time, if you owned a canal, you were considered to be very, very wealthy, and this was almost like Silicon Valley, where people would invest in technology. So at the time, people were investing in canals. So rich people would own, say, a canal up in Dublin or own a canal in England. And if you did, you would be very wealthy as you could tax people using your canal. However, the canals were overseen by trains. So in 1804, Richard Trevithick used Watt's steam engine to power his wheeled carriage called a locomotive along iron tracks. So it's important to know that even though canals were huge at the time, as soon as the steam engine came out, this overshadowed all the progress they had done on canals. This was further developed in 1830 by George Stephenson. He developed a locomotive called the Rocket. Now, this could reach up to speeds of 50 kilometers per hour. So, if we think of 50 kilometers per hour, it's actually quite slow. You could probably travel this speed on a bicycle. But if you think about it, this could pull very, very heavy weights, such as coal or timber or textiles. So, this is what made this rocket um, such an advancement at this time. Now, these trains were not only faster, but they were also cheaper than any other form of transport, and it helped to transport not only coal and iron, but it also helped the textile and agricultural industries. So, if you had to transport food from one side of the country to the next, or if you had to transport cotton or different materials from one side of the country, it could be transported by these new fast rockets or locomotives at the time they were called. And finally, the last form of transport within the transport revolution was shipbuilding. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, we seen wooden ships that were powered by wind, but now ships were starting to be created by iron, and these ships were powered by steam engines. So the first large ship known to actually make one of these trips was in 1858 by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who created the Great Eastern steamship, which was capable of carrying large amounts of passengers across the Atlantic. Now, this was very important for both trade and for communications and selling produce from the United Kingdoms to around the world. Now we see here that the turbine was on the side, and as we know, in modern day ships, the turbines were on the back of the ships to propel it forward. Now, we have already looked at what the Industrial Revolution was, and we all should know by this stage that it was a social revolution as it changed society in which people lived. Now, we know that it changed that society changed from an agrarian society to an urban industrial society also. Okay, so they're the two main forms that we know it has changed from. But in today's class, we're going to take a look more about the lives of people within the Industrial Revolution and take a look at how they have changed. Now, never before have we seen such an influx in population shifts within a society as we have in the Industrial Revolution, where people have moved from their farms and from the countryside into the cities to live and work. Now, this was down to the fact that farms and cottage industries were reduced due to the developments in agriculture and to textile industries, and we also know that a mass increase in workers needed within the cities meant to an overcrowding within the city centres. And as we can see here, the giant shifts from within a city in Manchester, it used to be 30,000 people lived in there, and within 40 years there was an extra 310,000 people moved into the city. Now, that's a huge dramatic change in population growth, and as you probably know, there probably wasn't the infrastructure set up for them. Now, due to this overcrowding, there was a lack of housing and facilities within the cities, and it led to some horrific conditions and forms of living. Now, as we can see here, the streets are mobbed full of people, and you can see the overcrowding even with people looking out the windows and the houses being full. Now, some of the conditions that people had to live through in these areas were poor qualities of water, so people didn't have the likes of a proper sink or clean water to drink from or to wash their hands or wash food. People had no proper sanitation. There was also no sewers, so no places to dump their waste or else to go to the bathroom. So a lot of people would use the rivers or else just open sewers to go to the bathroom. Also, there was families from up to 10 to 15 people could be living in one room. So if you think it's bad during COVID living with your family or your relations or guardians, imagine living with up to 15 people in one room. Okay, so these are very bad conditions. Now, also these living conditions were called slums back in the day. So areas where mass migration was moved into the cities, this was what we would call slums. So, in these cramped conditions within the slums, diseases such as typhoid and cholera spread like wildfire. So we had this was due down to the the bad drinking water and poor sanitation qualities. Now, in 1832, there was a cholera outbreak which killed 56,000 people. Okay, so we see here what the notices would have looked like back then, and they would have told people to make sure to be using clean water where they were drinking and to be washing their food. Now, another one was TB or tuberculosis due to damp living conditions, and also diseases such as smallpox spread in these cramped conditions. Now, not everyone was affected by this, and a lot of people from other parts of society seen these slums and said we need to put together unions to protect these people, which we'll be looking at next. Now, these unions that gathered together to fight for people's rights were called trade unions, and we'll probably know that word from trade unions in today's society. Now, trade unions were made legal in 1825. Now, these trade unions were set up by the workers, and there were groups organized in particular industries to form to protect people for or protect people's rights and their interests. So this would be such as wages, living conditions, say their rights as in within working hours and what they were entitled to. Now, these, as we can see here, we can see a picket line or else a demonstration or a march. These marches weren't made legal until 1875. So even though it was legal to set up a trade union, it wasn't legal to go out on strike until 1875. So it took another 50 years for people to be able to strike and to stop working and say, no, we're not putting up with these conditions until an extra 50 years later. We also seen in the 1830s where the Chartists were set up. Now, the Chartists were a group or a movement of people trying to get representation for workers within Parliament, as we can see here in the diagram. Now, the Chartists were shut down by rich and wealthy landlords who basically said no, that we're not letting people be represented within the Parliament, as many of these people were uneducated workers, and it didn't see them as having a place within Parliament. And finally, we're going to take a look at in 1833 there was the Factory Act. Now, I included this just because after talking to you last week, I had a question there from Kale who was asking about the rights for children within the factories and didn't know, or wasn't there anyone to protect them. Now, the Factory Act was set up in 1833 where no child under the age of 9 was allowed work. So if you were under the age 9 years old, you weren't allowed to work in any factories. 9 to 13-year-olds then were to work no more than 9 hours a day. So you weren't allowed to do these 12-hour shifts anymore that people were doing. You were only allowed to work up to 9 hours. Now, no child were allowed to work at night, so they weren't allowed to work past midnight. Also, all children were to receive 2 hours of schooling a day, which prior to this, children didn't, school wasn't compulsory and they didn't have to attend. And also, factory inspectors would be used to enforce these new laws. Now, as you can imagine, if you were, say, back in this industrial revolution and one of you had a job in a factory and you were getting, say, 2 pennies a day or 3 pennies a day, and now all of a sudden you weren't allowed to work in a factory, you would be very annoyed because one, your family would depend on it, and two, you weren't earning any money anymore. So you'd find it very difficult, and instead you would have to go to school. Now, this led to a lot of children upset with the fact that they were now out of work, but it meant that there was more jobs for men and women to get employed, where prior to this, children were taking their jobs due to the fact that they were able to earn a wage, and it meant that it made it very difficult for families to actually form an income with the amount of children being employed. So children were made go back to school and you weren't allowed to start work until you were over the age of 9. So that's very important to know. It's a very important act that was passed, the Factory Act. And in tomorrow's class, we're going to be looking at other different types of acts that were created. So by the end of this class, what you should all know is our different learning outcomes that we've gone through. So you should know the four major areas of the transport revolution, such as roads, trains, canals, and ships. So you should be able to name and list all those four major transports out. You should also know about the living conditions within the slums and know about the diseases associated with it. And also, you should know about the improvements to living conditions brought in and some of the key reforms. Now, we'll be going through more of these reforms in tomorrow's class. We just took a quick look at them today. Okay, I hope this helps, guys.